Welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian, your blog and podcast for all things international development, analyzing global injustices and building solutions for a better world. Hey everybody, welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian. Thank you so much for joining us for our Contrarian Humanitarian live 7th episode, a geopolitical discussion on Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. So thank you all for tuning in. You are in for a very special podcast, like always. Through lived experience, political action, community organizing, activism, and research, we are joined by 3 very distinguished guest experts on Eastern DRC. Today, we have Ntanyoma Delphin, who is a blogger and PhD candidate researching micro-level conflict in Eastern DRC. We also have Soni Muragizi, who is president of a political party, APFP, and a U.S. refugee resettlement coordinator. And we have Patrick Bagabo, who is a U.S.-based Congolese activist. So welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian, everybody. Our guests will join us shortly. So just a little bit today about our discussion. As I said, we're going to be speaking about Eastern DRC. We hope this podcast is for people that are familiar with the region and people that are not familiar with the region. DRC, Congo is incredibly important to be aware of what's going on there politically, conflict-wise, resource-wise, historically, everything. There's so much here. So maybe this will be a multi-part series, but we highly encourage everybody to do more research on DRC and the conflicts going on in the East. Not only is DRC an important conversation because of the conflict, and we're talking about people's lives when we're talking about conflict and the repercussions of that. And also in a contrarian humanitarian sense, DRC is kind of an epicenter of a lot of NGOization of humanitarian efforts. And so we might get into that a bit. But I encourage everybody to do their own research into what's called sort of the NGOization of DRC there. So this conversation, there's a lot going on. Like I said, we may do a multi-part series, but let's go ahead and bring all of our guests in who are going to be sharing their wisdom with us and their expertise on this region. So if everybody wants to go ahead and give themselves a short introduction. I'm going to say hi. Okay, so first let's introduce Ntanyoma Delphin. If you would like to say hello to the audience.
Thank you, Erin and Mike. Hi, everyone who is joining us in this debate. My name is Ntanyoma Delphin. I'm a PhD candidate working on micro-level conflict in Eastern DRC. That's mainly North Kivu and South Kivu. I'm a blogger, but also an active of the region. I'm glad to join this debate along Muragizi's son, but also Patrick.
Soni, you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes. Again, hi, everyone. My name is Soni Muragizi, and I'm from Eastern DRC. The place will be talking shortly, and live in the US. We have an organization or political party I'm heading, which is called the Alliance des Patriotes Fédéralistes pour la Paix. And also, what I do, I'm a resettlement coordinator, working with Migration Department of Refugee. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Bagabo. I am a US-based Congolese activist who has been involved in so many activism activities here in the United States, mainly focusing on the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the greater region of East Africa. And I'm also a businessman. I consider myself to be a businessman. So we'll be pretty much be interested in discussing and sharing the wisdom as regard to economic impact of the conflict in the region.
Great. Thank you, everybody, again for joining us. I'm really excited to have this conversation and to bring what's going on in the DRC, specifically Eastern DRC, to light, even though, I mean, it is, it needs to have a bigger light on it, as we know. This conflict is important, so thank you again for being here. Let's start with Ntanyoma. If you could start with the geopolitics of East Africa and kind of narrow it down to Eastern DRC and the conflicts we're going to be talking about today. So if you could kind of set the stage, a larger stage, and then kind of help us get down to where the conflict we're going to be speaking about today.
Thank you, Erin. I'm sure we might have an audience who's familiar with the Eastern Africa. Comprises mainly countries, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania. DRC is in a move of joining the East African community. But for anyone who probably needs to understand the Eastern Congo conflict, it involves mainly Congo as a country, but also different countries which have been involved to some extent in conflict in DRC. That's Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi. Tanzania has recently been part of the UN peacekeeping mission, part of the brigade which is called Intervention Brigade, part of the MONUSCO. But when it comes to maybe discussing deeply conflict and the actors, one can mainly look to Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC itself. It comprises, as largely discussed within the scholarship, within the research or many literature, it comprises the Ituri, North Kivu, and South Kivu, but also to some extent Manyema. Manyema, North Kivu, South Kivu used to be part of one province called the Kivu, which was split around 1988 into three distinct provinces. Then, for being bordering, I mean, the three countries, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, the region has some dissimilarities. That's what I'm trying to explain. When we refer to the Eastern DRC, it's simply because this is a region which has some dissimilarities vis-a-vis other provinces of the DRC. Since the 90s, the Eastern DRC has been going through recurring violences, violent conflict, civil wars, sometimes spilling over from neighboring countries into DRC or from DRC to the neighboring countries. Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda have been involved since the 1990s let's say 90s, but in an extensive way since 96, 98, probably up to now. But at the same time, the Eastern Congo region, that's Ituri, North Kivu, and South Kivu, has served to large extent as a stronghold of rebel groups trying to attack these countries. That's how, when someone needs to understand the Eastern DRC, probably that's a large picture. And that's why it's hard to dissociate the three provinces of DRC from the whole region, which is defined sometimes as a Great Lakes region or the Eastern Africa.
Thank you. Okay, so we have Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania, and DRC in East Africa. But that's what we're gonna, refer to as East Africa, or DRC is trying. You said trying to be a part of the East Africa, and there are conflicts going on in East Africa and DRC that are resulting in conflicts in Eastern DRC that are sort of bleeding through the borders, I guess. Okay. And so what are, that's a lot of conflict. If you could break down the conflict maybe by, which East African country, why are they involved in the conflict? What do they have to gain in the conflict, and what is their positioning?
Great. That's a huge debate. Anyone who is following the situation in Eastern Congo, but also within the Great Lakes region, there is a huge debate of who is doing what and who is not doing what. But maybe to try to refer to your question, Uganda has a rebel group based in DRC. That's started around the 90s. It's evolving recently into a terrorist group, as it has been designated by the US State Department. It's called the Allied Democratic Forces. It used to be Allied Democratic Forces, NALU, National Alliances of the Liberation of Uganda. Rwanda has a group called FDLR. It's based in Eastern DRC since '94. It's somehow an offshoot of what's called the Interahamwe Hutu militia. They crossed the border in '94 when the current ruling party in Rwanda seized the power in Rwanda. And since '94, they are still active. Of course, one can read some changes in terms of their political orientations and their political move, but it's somehow linked to those who have, since '94, been actively operating in DRC. Then they seem to be intending to overthrow the ruling regime in Rwanda. The current ruling party in Burundi, it's called the CNDD-FDD, came to power from the Eastern DRC since 1993. When Mekio Ndadaye was assassinated, they evolved a rebel group which ended up being in power in Burundi. But recently, from 2015, when there was a contestation around the third mandate of the late President Nkurunziza in Burundi, there is a group of rebels, let me call them rebels, who operating in South Kivu with an aim and the intent to probably overthrow the ruling regime in Burundi. At the same time, from 96 up to recently, Rwanda has been supporting rebel groups who have intended to overthrow the regime in DRC. Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda have actively been involved along Angola in 96 to overthrow the President Mobutu. Rwanda, Uganda, and partly Burundi have been involved in 98 along rebel groups, that's the RCD, MLC, to overthrow the Kabila's regime. Around 2007, Rwanda has partly been involved. I'm sure it dismisses it's called this as an allegation, but many do agree Rwanda has some extent backed a rebel group or a rebel insurgency called CNDP and a general whose name is Laurent Kunda is currently in custody in Rwanda. And later, 2012-13, behind an offshoot of CNDP, it's called the M23. The recent, that's how split one group in Rwanda and another one in Uganda. In between, there has been a proliferation of hundreds and hundreds of local armed groups, the Congolese one. And the main one work, they were operating an heterogeneous umbrella called the Mai Mai. Mai Mai simply means those who believed in the power of witchcraft. I think it's called what? Witchcraft. By using water combined with the witchcraft, they believe this can turn a bullet into water. It means you can use a bullet, a machine gun or a Kalashnikov, and doesn't work because they believe in such witchcraft. Hundreds of them are operating in Eastern DRC next to those who are trying to attack Burundi, yes, Burundi, and then those who are probably intending to attack Rwanda, and those also who are trying to attack Uganda. Probably to cut short this story, which is very wide, I might say these rebel groups who claim to be intending to overthrow whether Burundi, Rwanda, or Uganda, in recent years have been more attacking local Congolese than the countries they intend to overthrow their regimes. For anyone who is familiar with the story of FDRR in territory called Walikale, it's really a mess as you realize the way they have been committing atrocities to local civilians. This is one of the reasons of the proliferation of armed groups. Many of the local armed groups in DRC have evolved or emerged in a sense of self-defense vis-a-vis these foreign groups. At the same time, you see these countries backing other groups, insurgent groups attacking DRC, and then that's how the situation in Eastern DRC becomes more complex. You find the local armed group trying to defend themselves vis-a-vis the foreign groups operating in DRC, but at the same time, these local groups are also trying to counterattack a form of threat coming from the neighboring countries of DRC, that's Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda. I'm not sure if I might be able to really break such a complex situation, but this is really a big picture. Maybe try to add some insights of my personal experience, but also I'm sure Soni and Patrick might have something to add on my story.
Yeah, Patrick or Soni, if you want to add something to the bigger context for the audience, just to make sure I understand. So you're having rebel groups operating inside Eastern DRC that are from Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda.
Yes.
And they are attacking people within Congo, primarily Banyamulenge, or all ethnic groups?
There is a specificity around attacking the Banyamulenge. It has some specific features within the Eastern DRC complexity of violent conflict. I'm sure, as I was simply trying to give a large picture, I thought we'll be discussing the situation of the Banyamulenge maybe later on. But that's the point, maybe try to make it again clear. Let me just use an example to make it clear for someone who is not familiar with the region itself. The rebel group operating in DRC from Rwanda, who are intending to attack Rwanda, let's say the FDRR, at the same time, they are claiming, I'm just trying to call it a claim, they are claiming to attack Rwanda. At the same time, they attack local Congolese. Not simply the Banyamulenge. The ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces, intending to attack Uganda, overthrow the Ugandan regime. That's probably a claim. At the same time, they are attacking Congolese locals where they operate. That's similarly the groups in South Kivu trying to overthrow the Burundian regime, the current one. At the same time, they attack local Congolese. At the same time, as in terms of a proxy warfare, I'm sure many would get the meaning of a proxy warfare. These countries trying to counterbalance any threat from DRC, they do support other armed groups in DRC. Then, if Rwanda would back any insurgent group inside DRC, it creates another layer of threat to local population. That means at the same time, local population are trying to organize themselves into self-defense group. They counter-attack the rebels trying to overthrow a Rwandan regime, but at the same time, they are trying to counterbalance any threat coming from Rwanda through a proxy group that would operate in Eastern DRC. Then, maybe to just wrap up around the situation of the Banyamulenge, the Banyamulenge are locally considered as not Congolese. That's the main aspect differentiating the Banyamulenge vis-a-vis other local ethnic groups. I'm sure there are also other groups which are somehow contested. But as we are referring to Banyamulenge, let's take the Banyamulenge as an example. The Banyamulenge as a contested group, which largely other local ethnic groups consider them as not Congolese, but also they do tend to refer them to Rwandans. At some point in 96, 98, there has been some Banyamulenge who have allied with Rwanda or Burundi to claim one of their rights in DRC. Whenever any conflict arises in Eastern DRC, mostly one tends to see the Banyamulenge at the center of the debate or at the center of the conflict. Why this? It's simply because the Banyamulenge as a contested group has at some point allied with these countries, that's Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. At some point, the Banyamulenge have realized they are somehow being instrumentalized by these countries. They started to fight back again against these countries. I'm sure Soni would help us to more understand this story. Then locally, they are contested by many of the local armed groups who do consider themselves as an autochthonous group or a native or indigenous group. Whenever any local armed group is trying to build its popularity inside DRC, it has to claim attacking, or at least it has to attack the Banyamulenge, just trying to claim it's trying to protect the Congolese territory. Probably that's how I can explain. The key point was simply local armed group. Many have evolved or emerged because of the presence of foreign armed groups, these rebel groups who are intending to attack Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. At the same time, these local armed groups are also feeling the gap because of the weaknesses of the Congolese state. They also feel the gap of securing their locals against any threat that comes from these countries. I hope I'm not confusing.
It's just there's so many layers to this, and exactly. I think so. If I'm understanding this right, the rebel groups from other countries in DRC have a claim that they are essentially training to then overthrow their own government. But while they're operating, while they're training within DRC is also sort of utilizing them, or they themselves are attacking Congolese people.
A little bit addition on what Delphin mentioned was, yes, we have a group opposing the neighboring governments like Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda. So those people, they are in Eastern DRC, nearby their borders, training, of course, for their own political plan they have. But since whatever they are doing, it's in our region, they pretty much get everything they can from the people, including like the food they get, it's from the local people. They don't buy, they just go and get it. And they're eating their like cows and other stuff. So the conflicts with them, that's how it started. But in a little bit of Eastern DRC, especially the conflict we were talking about happening against Banyamulenge, it is actually ongoing genocide. It had the 3 steps. The first one was Congolese leaders, political leaders who are working for Congolese government, the DRC government. They had a plan with the neighboring countries, especially those militias who are actually in DRC. They work with them to finish the Banyamulenge or remove them at their own territory. As he said, the conflict, people are, like the local citizens are saying that Banyamulenge are not a Congolese. Politically, they don't understand or they ignore it. Before independence, Banyamulenge has been there. Before they divide the country, Banyamulenge has been there. And as we live nearby the borders, of course, many people, everywhere where DRC is touching other countries, there's people who actually found themselves in DRC who I guess were supposed to be in the other side of the country, like by the language, origin, some of the ethnicity. So that's a conflict around the whole DRC. So, but legally, the government understands everything. So that's where he deferred as Banyamulenge not considered to be a Congolese, mostly by the local citizens. And how we actually, it continued, and the way we are associating, the way Congolese associating Banyamulenge with the Rwandan or Rwandese was, yes, politically happened, early 1980s, where Banyamulenge realized there was a kind of politics, change in the politics going to happen in the region. They went in Uganda to join the Ugandan military to be able to work with the Rwandese. And actually, early in, once they gain Rwanda, many Congolese, especially Banyamulenge, other people in North, they joined the Rwandese military. The plan was probably, it was not an agreement, but once they actually get Rwanda back, they will be able to help the rest of the Congolese, especially, I would say, the people have been working with them also to get the DRC. And it was very clear, the plan was attacking Rwanda started from Ugandan border. They knew it, the opposition will have to flee heading in DRC. And the plan was actually to follow them. And it happened in 1996, where the people who associated themselves with the Rwandese, they were able to get help from Rwanda and actually gain the whole country. In 1998, where the conflict started again, where Rwandese were supposed to go back in Rwanda, many people confused them with the Banyamulenge, and other people have been working with them. So they said Rwandese have to go back with the Banyamulenge people and other people who kind of speak the similar language or live by the border. That's the main conflict, and it's still going on until now. And of course, with those opposition who they are doing their trainings in our country, I would say in DRC, South Kivu, they did actually successfully work with some of the politicians from DRC to actually remove the Banyamulenge from their area, go back in Rwanda, or that's what we are calling genocide. It had the 3 steps. The first step was to actually finish their I would say mostly cows, because the Banyamulenge are known for they have cows and they cultivate, they have farms, so they started by finishing them. They had gone to several places and actually were at this point, the cow has been gone, and they started burning the houses and burning the farms, realizing that once they don't have anything to eat, they are not going to survive. So that's how the first step was. The second step was actually to burn the houses and do everything they can to make sure they don't have anything to help them live in the country. At this point, it's at the point where right now we have a very big area called Rulambo. They were able to actually in one day remove the whole Banyamulenge in the whole area. They're in a camp in Plain. I don't remember the name, but the person I was talking to, he said they were in the church. About 5,000 people in the church with no international help. Like, as I said, I work with Migration Department of Refugee. Those are internal displaced. UNHCR and other people works with refugees or internal displaced. We should be able to help those people. And the big concern is, yes, they don't have food. We know global pandemic, COVID is there. 5,000 people in one location with no medicine, with no food. This actually is causing a big problem. People are not getting any help they should be getting as internal displaced. And of course, what happened back in 2004, where Banyamulenge refugee fled from DRC to Burundi, they had a camp nearby the border, and they came and actually massacred so many people. 100 people are dead in like a couple hours. Our big concern is those people don't get any assistance at this point, and their security actually is in danger. So as we continue to talk, we'll be referring to those people who actually internally displaced, but also who are not able to get the help they should be getting at this point. We understand it's in the rural area, not a developed place, but they should be getting the help they need. And we are very positive that they should be getting the help to be able to at least survive as internal displaced people. I don't want to take more time. We'll be sharing or taking the turns, but back to you, Eden.
Thank you. And there are multiple conflicts that we're talking about, but the conflict the most recent one, when did that start? Because there's different, I've been looking online and there's different dates, and just want to be sure what you're talking about.
Officially or technically started in 2017. That's when the whole process started. Although the conflict in the region has been there from, we may say from at least 1996. But the conflict against Banyamulenge was there before, like 1964. But the recent one started in 2017, sorry. And it started slowly in one place, one village, they will burn it, and then another village. But the recent big area to actually be burned in one day, it was like a week ago. I don't remember the date, but it was like a week ago. Delphin, if you remember the date. For the Rurambo.
This took place between 9th and 22 April.
Okay.
Thank you. So yeah, Patrick, yeah. Sorry.
So one addition that I think is very important this discussion that feels like it was left out is the accusation by the majority of the Congolese people towards Banyamulenge that they are behind these conspiracy of balkanizing the DRC and making the eastern part of DRC a whole other country. Like, you know, the Congolese from other ethnic groups, mostly political leaders, have accused this small community of South Kivu of being involved in, you know, in a series of war that dates way back in history, to kind of gain power and be able to form a new country out of the eastern part of DRC. And this is not specifically geared towards Banyamulenge only. This is geared towards the Tutsi people in the region, because the demonization that always leads to genocide in this eastern part of Africa is usually surrounding the identity of the Tutsi people. This is the same thing that we saw in Rwanda in 1994. So the same thing continues to this day, and it seems to have no end. Now it has migrated from Rwanda since 1994. Of course, that's 26 years ago. But historically speaking, things keep repeating themselves, if I can say that. So the Banyamulenge are accused of having this role in this plan to take the eastern part of DRC and make it a country. And the obvious example is recently there was a kind of, you know, the government of DRC gave a district to one of the areas in DRC, and that is Minembwe. Minembwe is majoritarily populated by the Banyamulenge people. Now, it raised a lot of questions in the minds of many Congolese. Why? Because they think this is the plan. The plan has been underway for so many years. Now they're starting in Minembwe so that they can get the whole country. Now we have so many, like, you know, audio recordings circulating all over the social media, talking about pretty much the demonization of these small tribe in southern part of South Kivu. So I would say yes, that exists. It has been going on for so many years, and the current wave of violence that started in 1996, and then, you know, recently in 2017, has to do mostly with the fact that, you know, the Congolese people are scared of these balkanization process that has been going on for so many years, starting in 1996.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. That's kind of where I wanted to go, because I think for a Western audience, people are very familiar with the Rwandan genocide in '94, but people are not familiar with what happened after the genocide and how that genocide interacts with DRC and the Banyamulenge people. And, you know, if you could expand upon the ethnic labels, Hutu, Tutsi, Banyamulenge, because that colonial legacy is, you know, those colonial definitions of people that were placed in Eastern DRC, in the area, and, you know, DRC itself, we've talked about this before, all of Africa was drawn up, you know, from the Berlin Conference without any care or research into actually how, not that those people should have been deciding the countries anyway, but, you know, there was no rhyme or reason based on the people there. It was just based on the resources they wanted to exploit from that area. So I think most people are familiar with Hutu, Tutsi, Rwandan genocide, but after that, I think people get a little lost. So if you could kind of break that down and how what happens after the genocide that then affects the Banyamulenge people.
I think I would start with the, where Son talked about the after the Rwandan genocide. Basically, we had these wave of refugees that went into DRC because they were fleeing the newly formed government, mostly ethnically Tutsi government in Rwanda. That is still currently in power. That is the government of Paul Kagame. It was at that point in time, it was RPF. Still, that is political party in Rwanda. So after the Rwandan genocide of 1994 against the Tutsi, we have to keep in mind that the people who stopped the Rwandan genocide was pretty much were a mixture of different people from different countries. It was not only the Rwandan Tutsis. No, it was. As Soni said, so many of Banyamulenge young men went to join the RPF when it was fighting from Uganda into Rwanda to overthrow the regime of Habyarimana. So these combination of forces that overthrow the genocidal government in Rwanda in 1994. They had a political agenda, as Soni said, of pretty much changing the entire political scheme or entire political picture of the region. And these people were supported by, current superpowers. So today we're talking about Contrarian Humanitarian. I know you have been covering so many, aspects of imperialism, right? So these people, they were supported by powerful nations, the United States, Belgium, which is a former colonizer in the region, and with the support of all these powerful countries, they were able to put an end on the genocide. Now, the agenda was to have a hold on to the resources in DRC. There's a whole, there's a number of books that have been written about this conflict. So the Banyamulenge people sent, I wouldn't say they sent their young people. Young people were revolutionary at that point in time in 1994. Why? Because of what was happening to them, right? And they felt a need to go out and help their brothers who were suffering in neighboring countries. So they went and joined the RPF after fighting in Rwanda. They toppled the regime. Now, these people who were supported by the United States government at that point in time, even though historically we know that Clinton's, the former President Clinton, his government was supporting the RPF in Rwanda, right? That was a military wing that was fighting against the regime that was committing a genocide, right? So there is a whole history there. So these young Tutsis who fought in this war had a name of going back to DRC and help save their own people, the Banyamulenge, right? And there was also, I wouldn't say the Banyamulenge specifically, but it was the Tutsi people, the Congolese Tutsi, let me use that term, right? Because even in DRC, in Eastern DRC, the Tutsis are pretty much kind of divided into two parts. There's Tutsis from North Kivu and Tutsis in the South Kivu. But the whole aim or the whole goal was going back to their country and help them, because at this point in time, since the 1980s, the Banyamulenge community or the Tutsi community in DRC, at that point in time it was Zaire, they were under some form of apartheid, if I can say that, right? They were marginalized by local government. So these young people, they fought. I consider them to be freedom fighters because they were fighting against genocidal ideologies that was pretty much plunging the entire region into chaos. So in 1996, after this group of young men toppled the genocidal government in Rwanda, they started planning on how to go and save the Tutsi people in DRC because they were facing the same threat that the Tutsis were facing prior to 1994. So they started planning a war. And then in 1996, something very, very tragic to Banyamulenge community happened. The Mobutu's government declared that all the Banyamulenge have, I think it was about 6 days, I don't know, or a matter of hours to leave the DRC. So these triggered the war that was being planned against former Zaire, right, the current DRC. So in 1996, the war started. When the war started, again, let's try to focus on these time in history, right? Because this is where the majority of all the agonies that Banyamulenge are facing today comes from, right? So we have a war that started in 1996, and it was mainly started as a Banyamulenge war, 1996. So if you ask a regular person, ordinary person in DRC to give some kind of narrative of what happened in 1996, they all blame it on Banyamulenge, right? So they say, you brought a war to our country, so you have to pay for it. So in 1996, the war starts. Yes, of course, there was a series of other events that happened after 1996, where we had Kabila come and lead the entire rebellion. And then they ended up toppling Mobutu, right, in 1997. But the war, the beginning of the war, it can be defined as a war for the Banyamulenge. So the ordinary person in DRC who lost someone who lost their belongings during that war, they all blame it on Banyamulenge. So this is where mostly where the demonization comes from, right? And some people might say it is justified, right? Because we have a war that has had so many consequences, chaotic results happening in 1996, and then under the name or under the guise of one specific community. So the war starts in 1996. This is the Banyamulenge fighting, right? So the war goes on, they topple Mobutu, and then they leave the country in chaos. So now this is where the international powers come in, right? The U.S. supported the entire war of toppling Mobutu because they were tired of him. He was not sharing the resources with them anymore. So they wanted to have a plan to eliminate him. So I believe that the entire demonization or the framing of the Banyamulenge as the main source of all troubles or in DRC can be traced back to that point. Even though I might add, before that, they were still being demonized. As I say, I use the term apartheid. They were under some form of apartheid in DRC. They were left in remote areas of the whole plateau of Minembwe or Itombwe, right? That's where they lived. They were not, they were being kept away from having access to educational opportunities like anyone else in DRC. I remember my parents, some of my uncles, they went to universities in DRC, with names that hid their pretty much to hide their identity. They couldn't reveal their identity. Why? Because they were Banyamulenges, right? And everyone felt like these people do not belong here. Are not Congolese. They're supposed to go to Rwanda. So to make my point clear, the Banyamulenge were marginalized even before 1996. But the events that started in 1996 made their situation in DRC worse even to this point.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, so let's stick in this kind of mid-90s time period, because Soni, you were talking before about how many Banyamulenge joined the Rwandan military in terms that they would receive Rwandan military help in order to, was it to overthrow Mobutu, or did they want to establish Eastern DRC? Or could you go into a little bit more of that? Like what was their cause?
Yes, there was no agreement, official agreement. That's what we had from the people actually joined the Rwandan regime at that time. But the clear information was, of course, that they knew it, their opposition or the people they were fighting with, the only way they had was to flee heading in DRC. And they knew it. Some of Banyamulenge people were part of those people actually changed the government. So it was automatically obvious that these people are coming with a very good plan to revenge to actually other Banyamulenge people were in the region where they flee to. And at the same time, the people who were in the RDF government, they knew it too. And they actually followed them. And in many places, they were served by the Banyamulenge who came from Rwanda and with the help they had from Rwanda. But the plan was to survive. Banyamulenge is one tribe out of about 400 tribes in DRC. They cannot control the whole country. But yes, after the government announced the Banyamulenge should live in 7 days, the plan was to defend themselves. And actually, if it's possible to overthrow the government, who were actually asking Banyamulenge to leave the country.
So it was only after the DRC government told or forced the Banyamulenge out that then the Banyamulenge were trying to create a greater military strategy? Or
before?
It was before?
It was before the whole war started in the whole country. But that was the main cause where the conflict was around, and the war started from one region already, and the government announced to actually ask Banyamulenge to leave the country in 7 days.
And can you give a little bit of the political history, like why did the DRC government, and because we have talked about the marginalization of Banyamulenge, but we haven't really fully got into the history of the Banyamulenge people and why they're even seen as immigrants or outsiders to Congo. And could you kind of give that backstory a little bit too, and why the DRC government decided or forced Banyamulenge out?
I will talk a little bit about it, and I will leave it to Delphin to explain more. The confusion started early in 1950s, where, as I started before, Banyamulenge has been living in where they live now before the Africa's divided or DRC. That's where they belong. That's where they have been before independence, before they divide DRC. Early 1950s, we had other Rwandese people moved from Rwanda to DRC just to be able to get a better place for their cows. And then the local citizen or the neighbors, they started confusing Banyamulenge with those other immigrants from Rwanda who moved in DRC in 1950s. And as that been said, that's actually where the plan started of actually changing the name. They were all referred to the people who speaks a similar language to Kinyarwanda as Rwandese. So the Banyamulenge community at that time decided we don't need to be referred as Rwandese. Actually, there's a conflict where a confusion. People are confusing the Banyamulenge who has been in the region for years with those people just migrated in 1950s. Then that's where they came up with the name Banyamulenge. We haven't mentioned more about what Banyamulenge name or where it came from. That's when they decided to go with that name instead of Tutsi or Rwandese or many other names people were referred the current Banyamulenge to. So yes, I think in short, that's where I'll be able to stop. That's when the Banyamulenge the name started and until now, and of course there were a mountain called the Mulenge where Banyamulenge actually were living. It's like the people from the mountain Mulenge who is the Banyamulenge in the language. Yes.
Thank you, Soni. Patrick or Ntanyoma, do you have any kind of historical Banyamulenge analysis to add to that?
Maybe Pat take that.
Yeah. So I think going back to the events that led to the war in 1996, the tensions in the region had been building up for so many years. In DRC, let me try to focus on DRC. The main reason they were given a couple of days to leave the DRC is because of the nationality question, right? So they were stripped of the Zairian at that point in time, the Congolese nationality. They were denied their rights to nationality, right? So and going back to 1990s when the RPF started in Uganda, it was the main reason that the Banyamulenge young men joined the RPF because they were denied of their rights in DRC, right? Why? Because they were seen as outsiders, invaders, right? People who were just taking land from other people. Specifically the Bafulero of South Kivu, another tribe in DRC, and the Babembe, right? So we had all these tension building up, leading up to 1996, and then the culmination of that was the ultimatum that was given to them by the Mobutu regime to leave the DRC. But that was intensified. The tensions were intensified by intelligence reports that was obtained by Mobutu's regime that Banyamulenge young men, right, were involved in toppling the Habyarimana's regime in Rwanda, and Mobutu was supporting the genocidal regime in Rwanda, right? So there was some kind of justification on behalf of the Zairian government. So they saw them as a threat. So there was something that was building up in the region, right? And Mobutu's government was scared, right? Mobutu's government knew that these young men are being trained to eventually overthrow him, right? Prior to 1996. So this is where all the instrumentalization of nationality came from. So he was scared of the people who were being trained in Rwanda to come and overthrow him. And there was an involvement, as I said, of the United States and Belgium and France. So France was on the side of Mobutu and the genocidal regime in Rwanda. And they were against all these, Tutsi fighters, Tutsi freedom fighters, because that is how they are identified as, in historical books. President Paul Kagame of Rwanda was recently visiting, I think it's a couple of days ago, he was visiting West Point here in the United States, and he was introduced as a freedom fighter, right? A military freedom fighter. This is how they were seen at that point in time, from the perspective of their supporters. But from the perspective of people that they were fighting with, they were seen as invaders, people who were taking land from other people. So the demonization of the Tutsi in DRC was there before 1996, but it intensified as a result of the Rwandan genocide. This was a revolution, if I might say that, military revolution that was led by young Tutsi men who were fighting against genocidal regimes, right? So upon taking the DRC as a country, we know what happened. The guy that they put in front to lead the rebellion turned against them, right? So he turned against them and started another wave of demonization, the humanization of Banyamulenge, and that is 1998. That was done by Kabila's regime. Mostly, part of the reason why the demonization started again was the international interests, economic international interests that were not met, right? The U.S. came in, they supported Kabila, they gave him guns, and young Banyamulenge soldiers, they toppled Mobutu. Now they're in Kinshasa, they're not able to deliver, right? The U.S. and all these powerful countries wanted them to deliver almost more than 80% of the resources of the country to them, right? The imperialism, right? Imperialism played an important role in the events that have led to the current consequences that we're experiencing in DRC. So that's pretty much, answering your question again, leading up to 1996, it was a nationality question. And that is what has been raised again today by so many politicians in DRC, and might lead to a greater regional war like the one we saw in 1996 if nothing is done by international community, or other African countries in the region.
Thank you. Okay, so we've been kind of dancing around it, but
add something there?
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, just want to just add a few points around the history of the Banyamulenge. My take is whenever we keep referring and compare the Banyamulenge vis-a-vis Rwanda, it's as if we are trying to repeat the same mistakes, the same colonial mistakes that led to what's happening now with the Banyamulenge. And many other ethnic groups in Eastern DRC, the Banyamulenge have migrated from different corners of Africa. That's a story well known. Did not happen only to the Banyamulenge, but also it's well known that Banyamulenge came probably from Burundi, Tanzania, Rwanda, but also Uganda. As many groups, ethnic groups living in Eastern DRC, possibly North Kivu and the South Kivu. We or myself know people who came from Burundi who currently are not considered as Burundian in DRC, who are not even the Banyamulenge, but they have managed to get another eponym or another affiliation of any other ethnic group. I also tend to read myself, but also referring to work of Vansina, what we know now as ethnic groups came from a political maneuver constructed during the colonial period. Possibly before the colonial period, local communities were referring themselves along clan lines than ethnic lines, because what we see now as ethnic communities, it's a formation of different clans that were considered as an ethnic group through political and technical strategic colonial maneuvers to trying to manage local communities during the colonial period. Then, whenever we go back, referring to Banyamulenge, to what happened in Rwanda between Hutu and Tutsi, it's as if again we are trying to commit the same mistake. But the Banyamulenge were, through the lenses of the colonizers, seen as affiliated to the Tutsi group. Through what's known as a Hamitic hypothesis, the Western people who were trying to understand the history of Africa, they thought people who are considered as farmers or agricultural oriented are more native as compared to those who were seen as pastoralists.
And who were the pastoralists?
The pastoralists were mainly considered as Tutsi. Then, where you can easily locate the Banyamulenge, they are more oriented on cattle herding. Then, by considering one group as indigenous and the other one as a immigrant, that's the origin of what became later as people who are invading. It means those who were pastoralists were considered as people who are trying to occupy indigenous land. The means, in a short way, I'm trying to mean what happened to the Banyamulenge has is not more linked to the genocide in Rwanda or Hutu and Tutsi social relation. It has rather an origin from such misinterpretation of migration and settlement in Eastern Africa or within the Great Lakes region. During the colonial period, when the Belgians were trying to establish and trying to form what's called as a political organizations in Eastern DRC, Banyamulenge were left out because they were still seen as people who came after. But there might be some other explanation behind, underneath. I'm sure the Belgians were mostly afraid of the political organization in Rwanda under the hands of those who were considered as a pastoralist and Tutsi. Possibly, the same feeling might have influenced the Belgian and Eastern DRC, just to think we don't have to let the Banyamulenge managing local authorities. Maybe they probably be against us at some point. The whole plight of the Banyamulenge and what's happening to them now, it's simply because let me not get it too simple as such, but it's more likely linked to how the Banyamulenge were left without any local entity into their hearts. Then any ethnic group, let's say the Banyamulenge, who were under the colonial period considered as immigrants, and then without any political organization locally, they are largely seen as non-Congolese. I mean, the contestation of the Banyamulenge started well before around the 1920s, and up to the post-independence period. And also, it intensified around 70s, 80s, up to 90s. That's well before the Rwandan genocide. Around 80s, a nationality law in Zaire, that's then the Congo now, has been changed simply to exclude, and specifically the Banyamulenge. A nationality law in DRC was enacted to simply exclude the Banyamulenge and possibly the Tutsi in Eastern DRC, but also those who are considered as more affiliated to ancient Rwanda, who are considered as Rwandan descent. By 90s, the Banyamulenge were denied the right to participate into what's called the Sovereign National Conference. That was during the Mobutu and democratization era. Congo or Zaire in the time organized a large conference where 1,000 people have participated to just discuss the Congo future within the democratic rule. The Banyamulenge did not participate simply because they were considered as not Congolese. It evolved up to 93, 94 during what's called a commission that was established through the conference, and the commission decided to simply expel the Banyamulenge because they were not considered as a Congolese. Within such a social, political, and security setting, many of the Banyamulenge youth started to join the Rwandan Patriotic Front. I'm sure it was somehow out of fear, out of such frustration, it was not really something organized, it was not systematic. These are few people who were simply sympathizing with the Tutsi in Rwanda, and then they thought can just simply join the Tutsi in Rwanda because the Tutsi in Rwanda seem to have the same problem as the Banyamulenge, but also as a Tutsi in DRC. The international community have largely failed to prevent the genocide in Rwanda. And what followed such failure was simply to plant the international community aids when Rwanda and the current ruling party in Rwanda was trying to move away a threat of the Hutu militia who were trying again to regain the power in Rwanda from the Eastern DRC. Millions of Hutu fled from Rwanda to Eastern DRC, that's North Kivu and South Kivu, after the genocide in Rwanda. Between 94 and 96, Rwanda was under huge threat of this group who were based next to the Rwandan border on the side of DRC. Rwanda resolved to attack the Hutu militia in DRC, and then it started to, Rwanda, the current ruling party in Rwanda started to find allies in the political justification of what we're doing in DRC. That's then. They managed to find an easier excuse around the situation of the Banyamulenge. It means the Banyamulenge were being denied citizenship right in DRC, at the point of being expelled and chased out of DRC, Rwanda, along Uganda and Burundi, because Burundi had a group of rebels who were operating in Eastern DRC, that's the South Kivu. The now ruling party in the Burundi was operating in South Kivu. Rwanda had an interest to get rid of the Hutu militia. Uganda had an interest to attack the rebel group who were based in North Kivu, but also on the side of Ituri. I hope I'm still making sense.
Well, you did, but why does Uganda have an interest again? Like, what is their...
Uganda had an interest to join the 1996 war in DRC because there was a group of rebels in DRC who were attacking Uganda.
Why were they attacking Uganda?
These are rebels who were trying to overthrow Museveni regime.
Okay. So it's... Oh, sorry.
Anyway, that's the point. I was just trying to elaborate and maybe bring my insight. Then the Banyamulenge were at the center of the debate, but also at the center of the insurgencies since '96. That's probably what Patrick was referring to. The 96 war started as a war to save the Banyamulenge. Of course, the Banyamulenge were under huge threat of, I seem to have overlooked such an important point. The Hutu militia who fled from Rwanda to DRC had the same ideology to kill all people who are considered as a Tutsi. Not simply because the Hutu militia knew in advance that Banyamulenge have joined the APF, but simply because the Hutu militia have in their minds anyone who looks like a Tutsi have simply to be killed. That's what they did in Rwanda. Then the Banyamulenge were under threat of such a large group of refugees, mainly the Hutu militia in DRC, who have fled around 1994. But at the same time, the Congolese or the Zairian state had decided to expel them because they are seen as immigrant, or as a stranger, as outside, as a foreigner, if I may say. the war started as a saving the Banyamulenge, who were under threat of being exterminated by the Hutu militia, but also the Congolese state. But behind such motive of saving the Banyamulenge, the international community, the powerful nation, have decided also to get rid of Mobutu, who was a dictator for 30 years in Zaire. And then this is an opportunity to get rid of Mobutu. He was no longer a reliable ally. I'm sure there was something around his management and the way he has been working and allying with the Western countries. Just one needed to recall, by 90s when Mobutu or the whole region was under the process of democratization, that's the end of what's called the Cold War. The change of the Cold War led to huge changes within the inside the politics in DRC, but also in different countries. By getting rid of Mobutu, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, but also their supporters, whether from the Western countries or within the Africa. A prime motive was simply to save the Banyamulenge, and then it evolved into overthrowing Mobutu, but also to get rid of the Hutu militia who were threatening the Rwandan regime. I'm sure that was the point I was trying to clarify. But we still need to stress the Banyamulenge are not only being attacked because of any link between them and Rwanda, but simply because of such a misinterpretation of migration history in the region.
Yes, I might add something to that. Speaking of the historical consequences of or the legacy of colonization, when the colonizers came to the region, if we remember from reading historical texts, they saw the Tutsi, if I might use that term, or anyone who looked like them, mostly in Rwanda and Burundi, they were seen as superior to the farmers, right? So when white people came to the region, they're like, okay, these are farmers, these are pastoralists, and they started the campaign of divide and conquer. And every administered area that was under the rule of the kings, like Tutsi kings in the region, they didn't change the colonial administration. They worked hand in hand mostly with them. If you look at Burundi and Rwanda, you can see that. So they worked hand in hand with these kings because they thought they were so powerful that to the point that if they fight them to impose colonial administration, they might fail. So the same thing translated to the current DRC, right? So they saw the Banyamulenge that were in DRC as a threat, right? They were living with other communities, including Bafulero, Babembe. So I believe they thought that if they give power to these people, they might work against them quite as much as they saw that in Rwanda and Burundi. Again, throughout the Eastern Eastern African region, every population that looks like Tutsi, they have a history of standing up to colonizers throughout history. You look, at countries, because in the region they also like to refer to Tutsi as people who came from Ethiopia. That is what was happening in Rwanda in 1994. They were killing them, telling them to go back to Ethiopia where they came from. So the colonizers saw that people who originated from those lands posed a threat for their colonial expansion in the region. So part of the reason why they didn't give political freedom to Banyamulenge in South Kivu can also be traced back to that, because they saw them as competitors instead of people that they can put out there and tell them what to do, and use them as their pawns. So the same legacy happened. If you look at everyone who came in power in that region has worked against the people who look like the Tutsis. Why? Because they see them as competitors. The same thing happens in Tanzania. People who look like Tutsis, they are demonized. People are scared of them. I lived in Tanzania. The time I was living in Tanzania, I always, I always didn't reveal my identity. Why? Because I knew there was a threat of seeing someone who looks like me or someone who looks like any other Tutsi as an outsider, someone who comes to take what is their own. So the same ideology has lived for centuries, and that is what is happening today. As a justification for the atrocities that are being committed against Banyamulenge. To add to that, we have to also know and understand the implications of modern superpowers. Countries such as the United States. I always consider the current political situation or the current conflict in the region as a result of the American foreign policy. The U.S. foreign policy in that region, starting in 1994, when they supported the APFP in Rwanda, and then they went into DRC, AFDL, and toppled Mobutu, it has always played out. This is the expansion of American influences. In 1993, something happened. I think we've all watched a movie about there was a battle that happened between American soldiers and Somalian, so I think rebels. I don't know what term to use here, but 1993, when that happened, after American soldiers were killed in Somalia, the U.S. Congress enacted pretty much another strategic approach to the region. The military involvement, the American military involvement in that region was reduced, and they started seeking some people on the ground, military leaders who can fight and defend the American policy in the region. Why? Because the U.S. Congress was not willing to send American soldiers or American people to go and fight for the American foreign policy. So this is when we had in 1990, that's when the U.S. granted a scholarship to the current president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, to come and study here in the United States. He studied at one of the top military schools here in the U.S. And when the war started...
Sorry. Was he... I think he was in Fort Leavenworth.
Yes. And is he in...
I'm not sure.
Yeah. So the U.S. was seeking people to place in the region and start defending and fight for the interests of the American people. Because at this point in time, as Ntanyoma said, it was at the end of the Cold War that ended in 1989, right? So the U.S. now is on on a mission to look for people that they can use in the region. Right at that point in time, Museveni had already, taken power in 1986 with the help of so many political international actors, including the former Soviet Union, that they helped him get power in Uganda. But after the Cold War, there was a shift in political power on a global stage, right? So we have the United States standing in the sole superpower. The Soviet Union was pretty much almost demolished. So now the U.S. was seeking supporters whom they can use to have a stronger say in the political landscape of the region. So this is when Museveni pretty much recommended Paul Kagame to come and study in the U.S. After Paul Kagame studied in the U.S., he went back to Rwanda, led the RPF, and they toppled the genocidal government in Rwanda in 1994. So now I want to focus on the implications of the U.S. foreign policy and how they play in this region. So after supporting the RPF and toppled, helped topple the genocidal regime, they sought to get rid of Mobutu, because at this point in time, Mobutu was not an ally anymore. Why? Because the Cold War was over and he was not willing to keep working with the United States. And in the US, there was a new administration that didn't want him, right? The Clinton's administration. They wanted someone that they can pretty much put in on the map in that region and be able to defend the US policy at whatever cost. And the greatest candidate was Paul Kagame. So with his RPF, they received military training from the U.S. There are reports everywhere of U.S. Military personnel going to Rwanda in the early 1990s to train all these, military freedom fighters that were being groomed to come and defend the U.S. interests in the region. And that is where the young Banyamulenge came into the picture. They gained access to specialized military training. They were prepared to attack and topple Mobutu. So this entire conflict in this region has mostly been, I would say, the interests of the superpowers, right? We have countries such as France. France that has had, very, very bad record, if I can say, in that region, because they were defeated in 1994. A battle that opposed pretty much, I would say, U.S. interests and French interests, and they were defeated. And the rest is history. We know what is going on today with the reports about the Rwandan genocide and how the entire political scheme is shifting in the region. Now, going back to DRC, the events there are having an impact to today's political events, if I might say, in the region. They're mostly about, I would say they're about the U.S. interests in trying to have more control over the DRC. Economically speaking, there was a number of interests. Like at this point in time, 1996, if we remember, it was during the pretty much digital revolution. This is where mobile phones were coming along, laptops, and all of these. The minerals were coming from DRC. Nowhere, the majority of the minerals that were being sought after were coming from DRC. So all of this is to say the U.S. has had an important role in whatever is happening today, either to the Tutsi people in the region or to the entire eastern part of DRC as we know it. So, and I believe that the solution, the solution will come from the approach that the U.S. government will always take in this region. I don't know if I made sense with that.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, so I do want to get into solutions since we just have about a little like 20 minutes left. Also, if people are paying attention and have questions, please feel free to go ahead and ask your questions, and we'll try to get to that. So yes, I do want to get to solutions, and I think a lot of the injustices that we've been talking about, the problems in DRC, Eastern DRC. For my opinion, can be summed up by colonialism and the colonial and neo-colonial legacy. We've talked about these terms, Tutsi, Hutu, Banyamulenge, like they are created terms to try to establish an identity, whether that was an identity for yourself or an identity to be oppressed by the colonialist. Also, I wanted to point out, too, about the United States and Belgium working together to kill Patrice Lumumba during the independence of Congo. So adding that to America foreign diplomacy. But anyway, so let's move into solutions. So Soni, why don't you talk a little bit about your political party and what your political party is doing on the ground and what work y'all have been doing to bring peace to the region?
Yes, I will talk a little bit about it. What we are doing on the ground is to explain the importance of working together as a whole Congolese. We know some of the advocacy has been going around in the country where many people are focusing to their own to their own community or tribe or the people they feel related to. But after being in places like US and other places, we have decided to work together as a Congolese, especially in Eastern DRC, where we'll be able to work together. It's like, yes, we may be different, but we are all Congolese, and we have to work together to develop our areas where many places were left behind. The government is not like building schools or roads or anything. So because of many reasons, but one of the reasons is those places are not secured, they're not safe. There's no international organization because of the conflicts happening in the region. So once we work together, removing the barrier of ethnicity, we believe that Congolese people will be able to work together without discriminating people with their place of origin, language, ethnicity, or any other thing. So we are at the phase of actually mobilizing, talking to different ethnicity groups to actually be one, let's love our country, work together. That's what I can share at this point.
Thank you. And say the name of your political party again. I know it's in French, but say it in French.
In French, it's called the Alliance des Patriotes Fédéralistes pour la Paix.
And where could people find out more information about that political party? And if anybody else wants to share other local community groups that you know of that people could contact to find out more information about how they could support local efforts rather than, even though, we're talking about there does need to be an international effort in this region because a genocide is happening and genocide is calls for international community to come in and support. But of course, we also want to support local actors. So if you guys have can name other organizations or things to follow, support, go ahead and say those.
We'll be able to give you the name or the website in the chat later. And
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Well, then we'll put that up in the show notes later. So if you guys think of anything after the show, we'll put all of those links up for either on our website, YouTube, Facebook, whatever, so people can get in contact, find out more, and support local organizations and people in their area. Patrick or Ntanyoma, do you have any organizations off the top of your head or any solutions you know of that you want to discuss that are happening in Eastern DRC or outside Eastern DRC?
Well, so one can just try to just throw out some ideas. I'm myself not an expert in the field of international relations. That's how I was more excited to follow Patrick's debate. And I'm sure I would much appreciate in any case you may think how to invite other people to debate around the superpower countries' involvement into what's happening in Eastern DRC or largely in the Greater region. Might be willing to just come and join it to learn from them, as Patrick was trying to elaborate. I'm sure there might be some involvement of these superpower countries, let's say US interests playing in, France interests, Belgium, UK, China, and so forth. But myself try to suggest I'm more a micro level research oriented. Let me try to probably split into two angles when trying to just suggest what can be done. DRC itself, or the Eastern DRC, has never been governed. That's a region with a distance of 2,000 miles from the capital city, Kinshasa. You never see any connection between Kinshasa and provincial levels. Anyone who is traveling from Goma to Kinshasa, it costs as someone who is traveling from Kigali to Washington, or from Goma to Dubai. There is no any minimum sort of infrastructure. So that's the wide picture of DRC. As we are focusing on a region prone to violence, that's why probably we are discussing the Eastern DRC. I might say it has never been governed. Local population DRC or in Eastern DRC need to have or are probably requesting to be governed. We need to have a state fulfilling its mission at local levels. Whenever the Eastern DRC we still in the same situation, I'm sure we never get to any point where we can expect violence to stop. What am I trying to mean? There is no road that connects whether Goma to Bukavu. That's the nearest city. There is no road that connects Goma to any of its territory within the same province. Anyone who is traveling 100 miles from Goma within the same province, it costs around $200. $200. Yes, I've myself paid 150 from a region called, from a territory called Walikale to Goma. That's roughly 100 miles using a motorcycle. That's what. DRC has a problem of its army, which is very dysfunctional, and that's something that reflects a sense of a state. Whenever the security services are dysfunctional, unpaid, unremunerated, less equipped, how do you expect to get a stable region when the same army is committing the same atrocities as rebels or armed groups? I've never seen, that's my personal experience, any problem between communities. It's simply because people resorting to guns, resorting to violence, just in many cases to protect themselves, or some use guns to gain their livelihoods. Whenever there is still an absence of the sense of the state, a responsible state, I'm sure DRC or Eastern DRC keep rolling in a cycle of violence and for many years. Anyone, any partner, anyone who is willing to support DRC or to bring how his efforts to end violence in Eastern DRC need to consider such aspect. On another level, I was trying simply to mean we need to pay attention on such ideology that's originated from the colonial misinterpretation that keeps being reproduced again and again, dichotomizing local communities. Some are considered as invaders, immigrants. I'm sure the international community needs to pay attention. I'm sure I can't again request the DRC while I've stated myself, I think that's a state that needs to support itself. I might not again request the DRC state to look at such an aspect. I think that's the role of the international community. As we've discussed, we are recently experiencing a process of genocide against the Banyamulenge. It has an origin from a global responsibility. That's the colonial legacy. It's no longer something that will have to simply live in the hand of DRC because it originates long ago. That's a responsibility of the Belgian, but also the international community. The Banyamulenge are experiencing at being threatened toward being exterminated. At least more than 90 95% of their homeland has been destroyed. At least 100% of their source of livelihood has been destroyed. They are being removed from their villages, being burnt regularly. As a son who have raised the issue, many have started to flee from their homeland and their villages towards a region called Ruzizi Plain. Those who are living in Minembwe have been besieged since mid-2019 up to now. I would request, if possible, next time we might possibly discuss the situation of the Banyamulenge. There is a tendency of international actors to interpret the message in DRC within its complexity of violence. And then many tended to disregard such specificities around specific communities who have been for years considered as non-native. Then I'm sure if nothing is done at this point, we may end up experiencing another cycle of genocide, as it happened in Rwanda, as it happened in Darfur, as it happened elsewhere, simply because the international community is simply interpreting any sort of violence as an intercommunal violence, as an intercommunity clashes, and so forth.
Beautiful. Sorry, can I interject? Can I say something?
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a really beautiful summation of what we've been talking about. I think it is important what you're saying to ensure that the conflicts we're talking about stem from colonial legacy, Western imperialist legacy. They are not inherent among Banyamulenge people or African people as a whole, because this is a trope, or this is sort of a prejudice that Western nations, imperialists have about the whole continent of Africa. This has been going on for hundreds of years. Oh, they need to be civilized. They're just, always killing each other, fighting. This is just nonsense. This is propaganda. So getting into propaganda, because this is, such the crucial piece of why the Banyamulenge are being oppressed is through propaganda. And I know we don't have a ton of time left, but this is such a crucial piece. And if any of you want to say some, something in regards to the propaganda that is being put out there, because just in doing this, researching this podcast, obviously Soni and I have talked. Soni explained to me about the propaganda before, but it was only until kind of researching for this podcast that I actually was in spaces where I saw the propaganda myself. But it definitely, yeah. So I showed this to Soni yesterday. And if you could, I guess, speak to the proliferation of this propaganda as blaming the Banyamulenge for conflict, for war, for violence.
Thank you so much, Erin. Whenever they will make the Western, let me call them a Western, whenever they want to distance themselves with their responsibility on what happened in Africa or what's happening on the African continent, it's simply narrowed within the sense of barbaric African. That's not true.
Yeah, right.
That's not true. Because we have our own responsibility. But also, we need to remind the world it's not any Banyamulenge who have wrote a story behind the Hamitic processes. No.
Could you explain a little bit about the Hamitic hypothesis?
The Hamitic hypothesis is a long story that came with a guy who is a British guy, a captain, a military soldier, who once he arrived in Uganda, he started to tell people, I don't know, to differentiate people and then say, these are people who came from Ethiopia, Egypt, and the others are native. Then those who, for any reason, who might look like as Soni or Patrick, they were simply considered as immigrants, mainly because they were pastoralists, probably. It's a long story. And then the colonization started to build on such hypotheses, saying some group came after others. By anyone who I might refer to a prominent researcher who has written a book called "When the Victims Become," when the victim becomes the killers. That's Mahmoud Mamdani. He has well explained the way the colonial legacy and the colonial history has been translated into what became a genocide in Rwanda. The Hutu were simply saying we need to get rid of those who have been oppressing us for years. That was not really the real picture, simply because we've kept repeating and reproducing the same story from the colonial history. And then we are killing each other. It leads to a point of exterminating an entire group simply because we saw them, or we see them, or they see them as simply people who do not belong to any territory. It's based on physical threat. I mean, it's a physical threat or physical features, but also on a sense of economic activities. Let's say the pastoralists versus the agriculture. The point I was trying to make when the Western are trying to simply distance themselves vis-a-vis their responsibility on what's happening to the Africans, they tend to simply say, look, this is how they've been for years. They've been killing one another, a group against the other, simply because that's their minds. That's not true. Of course, I've said we have our own responsibility, but also we needed to remind the world, the colonizers, you have your own responsibility into what's happening to us. And then I'm sure anyone who is trying to distance from his or her responsibility, they seem to adopt a very simplified justification, a very simplified, a very narrow perspective to just explain what's happening on the ground. I've come across many stories, people who are writing on what's happening at the Banyamulenge. They seemingly try to narrow the whole tragedy into an inter-community clashes. That's totally or partly wrong. We know, let's say someone who is saying Elvin does not belong to this land. You've been told from your grandfather from the grandparents. You've been told these guys are not Congolese. And then we keep reproducing the same story because it has been written by a Belgian. Whenever you visit any museum or any archival store in Belgium, you tend to see the same stories. Then at some point one can try to accommodate myself. I do at some point try to accommodate anyone who has been told for years Banyamulenge is not a Congolese. It's transmitted, reproduced, shared across generation, and then in a such a void, security void, where the state is really absent. Anyone can resort to any means to just do whatever he or she wants to do. I do sometimes understand. Then I'm sure what you were referring to as a propaganda. Even as some of the propaganda have their origin or somehow linked to what happened during the colonial period.
I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. My cat just jumped up on the counter and distracted me. Okay. Sorry. What was did you have a question for me, or are you just summing up that? Yes, it is crucial to understand the colonialist legacy, the neo-colonialist legacy, or the colonialist underpinnings of the conflict, and that it's not, that the Banyamulenge are bringing this upon themselves. Because we're, at the end of our podcast, and I want to thank each and every one of you so much for all that you've contributed. And I hope we can do this again because, this is such a huge conversation, and we're just really getting into it. And you all have brought so much information. I really appreciate it. So if you all would like to say some maybe final thoughts, where people could find out more information, I guess we'll end it with there, and hopefully have another conversation to continue this. And maybe if you guys know of great organizations that are keeping watch on what's happening to the Banyamulenge community. I know Ntanyoma, you have the Eastern Congo Tribune, which we've talked about. Everybody should go check that out. That is some great reporting. And I wanted to get even into more because, Soni talked about, or you all talked about, how there's neglect in Eastern DRC in terms of international support. But yet we know DRC has one of the kind of biggest aid industries in the world. So how does DRC have one of the biggest aid industries, and yet the Banyamulenge are experiencing genocide? So that's another whole question that, we need to unpack and understand as well. Where is the international community? We know they're close, but they're not there. So what's happening?
Yeah, I might add to the solutions part of this discussion. I think the international community, yes, should stand up and take its own responsibility and find solutions to this problem. I believe that the solutions to the conflict in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo is a response. It has to come from the African Union. Currently, our president in DRC is the president of the African Union, the acting president. So as we saw throughout this discussion, we understand that many of the problems of the Banyamulenge are related to the current borders that were established by colonizers. We have borders that do not respect the interests of the people on the ground, but respect the interests of Western colonizers. So one thing that I always hope to see one day is a roundtable like the one that happened in Berlin in 1885, if I'm not mistaken, where the African people can sit down and establish their own borders, or they can get rid of the power those borders hold in whatever discussion they have. Because if we didn't have the border between Rwanda and Burundi, or between DRC and Rwanda, or DRC and Burundi, or DRC and Uganda, these whole genocide that's going on wouldn't have happened, because the current borders of DRC were established by the colonizers, right? Banyamulenge were left out mainly because of the interests of the colonizers. So the main solution, I think, will come from the fact that all these, borders, they're, I would say, imaginary, because they don't exist. People live on different sides of different borders in Africa. So if these borders can be demolished, and then we can have, the idealistic, African Union, or the United Nations of Africa, for that matter, that can be a good solution to the problems we have. Even though that feels and is very far-fetched, and it can happen, as a long-term solution. But in terms of local solutions, I believe they have to come from the youth. Young people have to stand up and recognize and acknowledge that their leaders have almost failed them. Right? We have non-existent, state powers. They are there to undermine their freedoms, to undermine their progress, for that matter. So education is the key. Young people should get out and get educated about what is happening in Eastern DRC, specifically what is happening to the Banyamulenge, all the Tutsi in Contrarian DRC, and try to understand the implications that there are being, they're on the ground, and how they're related to misinformed politicians, because these politicians that are in power, whether in Kinshasa or in Kampala or Kigali or Bujumbura, they all have their own interests, and they trigger and pull pretty much strings to undermine the peace on the ground. One good example, if you follow all the debates that are happening, political debates that are happening in DRC, you will understand that there are so many politicians in Kinshasa who are pulling strings in Eastern DRC and supporting these armed groups that are in South Kivu, they're in North Kivu, they're in Turi, to pretty much destabilize the region and commit this kind of genocide that we have been talking about. That's been going on for 3 years now, right? So the young people have to stand up, take the ownership of their future, because if they don't do that, the current politicians who are misinformed, who have their own interests, are going to lead the country to a point where there will be no coming back. So also the international community has to come in. I always talk about the responsibility of the United States foreign policy. The U.S. has to change the approach, if it hasn't done so yet, to help the DRC government build state capacity to be able to enforce state authority. Because we have people in Kinshasa who have no idea, or who don't support any kind of conflict in the Eastern DRC, who want peace for the DRC. And even the current government of Tshisekedi has tried, because doesn't have a track record of getting involved in conflicts. Maybe it might be involved at some point in the future, but as of now, this is a government that came out of a democratic process, partially democratic process, and this can be, can be a good starting point for the people of DRC if the U.S. government keeps, supporting the current government and helps in helping and trying to find solutions in terms of step building capacity, economic empowerment of the youth, and also making sure that the foreign policy doesn't keep supporting foreign actors who have been acting in DRC as we know it, including bordering countries or neighboring countries that have been involved in the region, partially because they try to keep protecting the U.S. interests in the region. We have a revolution that's coming up, the electric vehicle revolution, and now we're scared that this revolution is going to have an economic impact on the conflict, quite as much as the other past revolutions have had an economic impact on the conflict in the region. So yeah, that's pretty much. This is a very, very complicated conflict. It is really, really hard to understand it in just 1 or 2 hour discussion. But people, who support peace and freedom in that region should go ahead and try to get in touch with people who are there, and try to help end these caricature of misinformation that has been going on for years, demonizing the Banyamulenge or the Tutsi in the region, and now they're victims of regional politics that doesn't play into their interest. Thousands, as they say, Soni and Delphin, thousands and thousands of our people have fled their villages. Hundreds and hundreds of villages have been disseminated, and this is a consequence of something that no one wishes to anyone. This is something that is going to have a greater impact, not only locally in South Kivu, but also regionally speaking.
Thank you, Patrick. Soni, you want to say some final thoughts?
I'll add 1 or 2 things on top of the long-term suggestion for the solution in the DRC. Of course, the state needs help to build the capacity to be able to reach everywhere where there's a citizen and actually develop country, educate people, and we're hoping if we get to that in that stage, we'll be able to have a long-term solution in DRC. I'll go back to the point I was saying. We have many people internally displaced in the country, where they are at this point. There's a road there. Actually, the humanitarian help can get there. It will be the internal displaced people should be able to get help they can get, at least to survive as they wait for the next step, whether to go back in their place or cross the border to become refugees. That would be a big ask I would like to put out there. That's what I want to add on this. And as you have been saying, it's a very long story from the colonialism to today, which means we can break down as we go, and many people will be able to understand the cause where it came from, instead of just pointing the finger to each other or to the neighboring country. We need to highlight the main cause and the other contributed cause, but we really understand that division discrimination, different people seeing each other. It's a long, it came from a while ago. And of course, from the colonialism. I'll end there and say thank you, Aaron, for having this conversation with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Soni. Thank you, everybody, so much. I hope everybody can, please, if you're listening, share this. You know, this conversation is important. Hopefully we'll have more because it is so complex. And this, what's happening in DRC and Eastern DRC does not get enough press. And what we're trying to do in Contrarian Humanitarian is raise a global consciousness of all of these atrocities. Not only that these atrocities are actually happening in our current time, but where they came from and how we might go about fixing them, coming together. So again, I thank each and every one of you for being activists, for sharing this information, for all the work that you're doing. Hopefully we can all get together again. And just global solidarity to you all.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you for hosting.
Thank you so much for organizing the podcast.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, enjoy the rest of your evening or morning or afternoon. And yeah, thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.